Brother and sisters, your brother G World 7_D. Alright, and first off, before I get started, I need black folks to understand is that there's very different type of black groups that was here in America, of very different phenotypes. Alright, there wasn't just one type of phenotype, one type of facial structure, one type of hair type. So-called black people run the gamut. Because I'm hearing people saying that, well, Asiatics and the Native American mix of black people. I mean, let me be honest. The so-called Native American Day, the people who run around calling themselves Native American Day, either straight white or amalgamated image of a white, um, black, and Asian, or mixed Asian, whatever. And the original Asians were black themselves. So you gotta understand is that the Khoisan in Central Southern Africa have those features. They're the original people of those features. They come from brown skin to a yellowish color. And you see those features in them. And you see a lot of people, many people in South Africa with those features, like Mandela and his former wife Winnie had those so-called Asian eyes feature. So you see that amongst Africans, a very part of the continent of Africa, and then you see that obviously with some black people here in America. All right. It doesn't mean that you mix with Asian. There may be some people who had some Asian mixed in them, but non-black Asian mixed in them, but that doesn't mean that you have the lighter skinned Asian mixed in you. Those features are originally of very different groups of Aboriginal blacks globally. So we have to understand that. So the original so-called Asiatics that came to America were of swarthy skin complexion. So they had the physical gamut of what you call a Negro. But except for those, well, with those eyes, features, them see them eyes, those features originated with so-called Negroes. All right. So you have to understand that so-called black people come in very different hair textures, shades, everything. We've always done that. So I want to constantly hit on that because I'm hearing stuff that's just not accurate. All right. So I'm gonna go back to this book, The Middle Ground: Indians, Empires, and Republics in the Great Lakes Region, 1650 to 1815. All right. And what I'm gonna focus now is here when they talk about the Fox Wars. All right. Let me get a clear version, clear image. The Fox Wars provided the premiere for alliance politics. They told a cautionary tale to French and Algonquin alike. From them, all involved could draw a catalog of mistakes and the failures of chieftainship that, if uncorrected, would destroy the alliance. Populated by fathers who failed in their patriarchal duties and chiefs who failed to mediate, the Fox Wars demonstrate how fragile the whole structure of alliance was. The Fox Wars began in the lands around Detroit. During most of the first decade of the 18th century, Detroit was the only seat Ontario maintained in the west outside of the missions. Cadillac has persuaded Jerome Philpeux, I don't know how to pronounce his name, de Pontchartrain, the French minister of the Marine, to allow him to occupy Detroit by arguing that the Algonquins he gathered there could intimidate the Iroquois into observing neutrality in cases of future French wars with England. The settlement of Detroit in 1701, who coupled with Sieur d'Iberville's newly founded colony of Louisiana in the South, would supposedly block English expansion. Detroit thus officially faced east towards the Iroquois and the English whom it was intended to confine. Cadillac at Detroit and Ontario at Quebec remained mediators, but they desired to mediate only disputes between their allies around Detroit and the Iroquois, not disputes among other Algonquin groups. During the War of Spanish Succession, Governor de Vaudreuil repeatedly stressed that Iroquois neutrality was a sine qua non for the survival of Canada. Neutral, they blocked the invasion route from New York to New France to keep the Five Nations neutral. Vaudreuil played on their fear of his Western allies, while simultaneously diffusing any actual violence that might drive the Iroquois into the arms of the English. The task demanded all of Vaudreuil's considerable talents. Although the peace of 1701 had ended open warfare, the failure of the Iroquois to return all their captives created a great deal of tension, and the Ottawas, the Mississaugas, the Nipissings, and the Sauteurs increased the pressure by continuing to reoccupy lands north and south of Lake Erie and north of Lake Ontario, from which they had previously been driven by the Iroquois. The issue in this region was not territory per se, but rather the right to trap beaver for trade. Virtually all Indians granted the right of hungry people to take game. Virtually all Indians granted the right of hungry people to take game, including beaver, where they found it. But the furs became the property of those who had the primary hunting rights on the land. These rights the Iroquois claimed by conquest, but the Algonquins regarded the Iroquois as uninvited and unwelcome guests rather than as conquerors. As a result, both groups murdered each other with alarming frequency and recklessly overhunted the beaver and other fur beavers in the contested area. Young beaver, which the French reported had earlier been routinely spared, now flooded at the market. Apparently, Indian hunters acted on the theory that their rivals would take any animals that they left. Only Governor de Vaudreuil's repeated personal intervention prevented war. He covered the dead hunters and obtained compensation for Algonquin attacks, but succession was precarious. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended, the Iroquois were prepared to strike both Canada and the Pays d'Iroquois when, to counter this threat, Vaudreuil summoned his allies to Montreal to intimidate the Iroquois and, if necessary, to take up the hatchet. He discovered that years of neglect and reduced the Western Alliance to a shambles. The conference was an embarrassing failure. Only the fictitious end of the war in Europe saved him. All right. The French themselves will have to rediscover, though, through experience, that the alliance could not face east unless it simultaneously faced west. During the War of the Spanish Succession, Governor de Vaudreuil had allowed events in the west, even at Detroit itself, largely take their own course, and the old alliance had predictably disintegrated. In 1706, just before the fighting erupted between the Huron-Petuns, Miamis, and Ottawas, Displeasant had confronted M. de Bourgmont, commanding at Detroit in Cadillac's absence, with a long list of dead. The French had promised mediation and had held back Ottawa's war parties, but they had, in effect, done nothing. They were allowing the West to become the scene of bitter and festering conflicts, with Ontario failing to act as father. His chiefs, French and Algonquin, maneuvered for advantage. Only the Indians around Detroit and, to a lesser extent, those at the Michilimackinac had reliable access to Ontario, and the French attempt to draw many different peoples to Detroit made it a nexus of a village and tribal rivalries, intrigues, and violence. With the French failure to mediate these disputes, the chief logically sought to use the French against their rivals. In the struggle, the Ottawas and the Huron-Petuns, who were the first people to settle at Detroit, secured an initial advantage that they tried to maintain against their later rivals. The French war sucked into the maelstrom of rivalries both within villages and between villages. At Detroit, by 1711, the conflicts of villages had begun to dominate the politics of the empire. The language of the alliance disguised artful manipulation. Cadillac had employed the Huron-Petuns chief Michipichi, or Quaranti Souls, as his prime agent in persuading Algonquin villagers to settle at Detroit. Cadillac assumed, of course, that he was controlling Michipichi, but at 1704, Governor de Vaudreuil was worried that the collaboration was in contradiction with our invariable policy of retaining the Indians in a sort of submission. Cadillac had placed negotiations critical to an entire imperial strategy in the hands of a leader of the Huron Petuns, a nation that had for years maintained ties with the Iroquois, the very group the French had sought to intimidate in settling Detroit. Governor de Vaudreuil had good reason to worry. The interests Michipichi pursued were only incidentally French interests. Unknown to Cadillac, he carried unparalleled negotiations with the Iroquois and, at one point, considered settling his people among them. By 1704, even his nominal submission was so slight that, as Speaker for the Detroit Indians, he called the governor a liar. He refused to allow Cadillac's wife to return to Montreal, fearing that it was a sign that the French were about to abandon the post. And in 1706, it was Michipichi who audaciously transformed Cadillac's request that the Miamis join a French condoned attack on the Sioux into the message that gave French approval to the Huron Petun Miami attack on the Ottawas. These attacks began negotiations over the fate of Les Pleasant, that forced the French back into operating on an actual middle ground instead of in a fantasy world of French denomination. Okay, but the French movement was insufficient. Indeed, the stronger the French made their connections with the Indians at Detroit, the weaker was their hold on other peoples of the Pays d'Haute. While the old alliance had maintained its footing by incorporating a variety of Algonquin and French chiefs during these critical early years of the century, relatively few Algonquin chiefs dominated the councils with Ontario and Cadillac. The Ottawas and Huron Petuns of Detroit and, to a lesser degree, the Michilimackinac monopolized contracts with the French. Even during the 1690s, two groups had been disproportionately represented in the Montreal Conference, but then the Indians of the further west had easy access to the French chiefs at the post or to licensed traders in their villages. After 1700, the dominance of the Ottawas and the Huron Petuns was nearly total. Quarrels between the Ottawas and the Huron Petuns engulfed Detroit in 1706, but that fighting only foreshadowed a far greater cataclysm in 1712 through 13, when the French failed to diffuse tension resulting from the migration of more powerful outsiders, this time the Fox, to Detroit. The result was fighting on such a scale that the French mistook a clash between villagers for an imperial confrontation, as they had earlier in the controversy over Le Pleasant. Village politics overwhelmed imperial politics. The trouble began in 1710 when more than 1,000 Fox, along with their Kickapoo and Mascoutin allies moved to Detroit at the invitation of Cadillac. Mascoutin. Okay, from Detroit, they hunted in southern Michigan, northern Indiana, and northern Illinois. They also opened, as had the Ottawas, Huron, Petuns, and the Miamis before them, tentative diplomatic and trade negotiations with the Iroquois and the British. They did all this with an arrogance and ready violence that alarmed all the nations of the Michilimackinac, south to the Peorias. The Fox claimed, presumably on the basis of their residence in the area before the Iroquois Wars, that they were the rightful masters of Detroit. Soon rival hunters were murdering each other in the woods. The situation created by the French demanded the French mediation, but Governor de Vaudreuil was at the time understandably preoccupied with the danger of the Anglo-Iroquois invasion of Canada, although he precisely warned the Fox not to provoke a conflict that might destroy them. He delegated the affair to the Detroit chiefs and to the temporary commander at Detroit, Joseph Guyon de Bussien. Events rapidly escaped de Bussien's control. The report this poor Frenchman submitted of what followed is full of mysterious comings and goings, British plots, fortuitous rescues, and the inexplicably failure of the Fox to undertake the attack about which they and the British had supposedly long conspired. It is a document written by a man who never understood what was going on around him. Debussy had gotten his conspirators wrong. The Fox were not conspiring to eliminate the French. Instead, virtually all the Algonquins, from the Peorias to the Ottawas to the Michilimackinac, had agreed to eliminate the Fox. Mascoutins and the Kickapoos from southern Michigan and surrounding areas. The other Detroit Indians and their allies not only refused to negotiate their differences with the Fox, but they prevented